Hey everybody, this is Curtain on the Metaphysics of the Trials by Cornelius Castoriadis, originally published in Socialisme ou Barbarie in 1956. It begins with a quote from Khrushchev's secret report to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, published in Le Monde on June 9th, 1956. And the quote goes, quote, "How can it be that a person confesses to crimes which he did not commit? There is only one way, after physical pressure, after torture has been applied, thus bringing him to a state of unconsciousness where he loses his judgment and abandons his human dignity. That is how the confessions were obtained." End quote. Khrushchev is speaking of only some of the trials and not the most important ones. Those whom he pities are in general his counterparts, true Stalinists, who, after having held down the heads of Stalin's victims on the chopping block, hardly had any time to feel the axe lop off their own necks. Postyshev, Kosyor, and Antonov Ovseyenko were caught in the works of the same infernal machine that they had helped set up, and which Khrushchev and the present leadership, who were luckier, more cunning, and also perhaps more servile, were able to escape. Khrushchev speaks only of some of the trials, but his explanation is valid for them all. In all the trials, confessions were the sole, quote, proof, end quote. That was in italics. We know that they were obtained by torture. Elsewhere, Khrushchev expresses his regret that the repression directed against the, quote, Trotskyists, Zinovievists, and Bukharinists, end quote, had been pushed too far, and says that a correct policy would have brought them back into the party. The Trotskyists, Zinovievists, and Bukharinists were condemned after having confessed that they were agents of Hitler, that they were working to unleash war and dismember the USSR, that they had poisoned the workers, that they derailed trains. To say that they should have been brought back into the party is to say, in the slimy and cowardly manner that is Khrushchev's, that everything was trumped up, that these confessions had been extracted by torture, and therefore these trials too were machinations pure and simple. Indeed, in most of the satellite countries, the trials of Stalinist leaders who previously had, quote, confessed, end quote, their treachery, Rajk, Kostov, etc., have been hastily, quote, revised, end quote, and these leaders have been, quote, rehabilitated, end quote. Nothing remains of the trials. Nothing remains of the metaphysics that people wanted to erect. Nothing remains of the metaphysics that people wanted to erect based upon their example. Nothing remains of the theory of objective guilt, of agonizing choices between politics and morality, of the crisis in the Marxist dialectic that they were supposed to have expressed. The argument goes as follows. The opposition needed allies. It might have been able to use the kulaks, and the latter might have been able to get beyond their control and succeed in restoring capitalism. Therefore, opposition culminated objectively in preparations for the restoration of capitalism. This absurd example of Sorites, Sorites, bursts apart, leaving us only bits and pieces of the foul concoction cooked up by the prosecutor. Upon it, the philosopher had tried to confer a factitious meaning for his own usage. Factitious, for from the very start the trials were interpreted by situating them in a revolutionary perspective they never shared. The accused had abandoned the terrain of proletarian struggle many long years before. How could the supposed conflict in Bukharin's or someone else's conscience have expressed a crisis in the Marxist dialectic under such conditions? At the very most, they might have given expression to one of those insoluble antitheses between, quote, morality, end quote, effectiveness, end quote, that belong organically to bourgeois politics. We do not mean to say that a revolutionary politics by definition never would find itself faced with insurmountable contradictions, or that for this kind of politics the solution to every possible conflict is guaranteed in advance. But such contradictions appear only in borderline situations. They indicate a stopping point in the development of the revolutionary process, and it is inconceivable that they will persist in the course of its development. To say that the Russian rulers and their opponents were seized by the throat between 1923 and 1939 by a conflict between, quote, morality, end quote, effectiveness, end quote, between, quote, intentions, end quote, results, end quote, between, quote, program, end quote, reality, end quote, is to say quite simply that these rulers and their opponents, whatever might have been their, quote, intentions, end quote, no longer were able to place themselves on the terrain of the objectively revolutionary problematic, because the configuration of the historical process and the place they had assumed in it prevented them from doing so. It is to say that after 1923, Russian society was dominated by the fundamental scission between truth and effectiveness, between the internal and the external, between direction which now knows, calculates, and acts, and execution which does not know, which waits and suffers. This scission being constitutive of an exploitative society. We then are referred back to a concrete historical analysis of contemporary Russian society, of the economic and social nature of the bureaucracy and of the role of Stalinism. Fleeing from this analysis and discussing rather the problems faced by the system's politicians, whether the rulers or their opponents, the philosopher, by placing these politicians within a revolutionary context without asking whether they were still part of that revolutionary context, creates an imaginary opposition between reality, which is turned back into the simple reality of exploitation and alienation, and its projection on the screen of revolution, an arbitrary projection for which he alone is responsible. One could have discussed the insoluble contradictions with which a revolutionary politics might collide, not in relation to the Moscow trials or even to the, quote, capitulations, end quote, of 1928, and made them inevitable, but with regard to Kronstadt, for example. One would have perceived then they do not express simply a crisis in the Marxist dialectic, but much less and much more at the same time a crisis, a stopping point, a setback for the revolution itself. And certainly this halt, like a new departure for the revolution, could not help but pose problems that would have to be examined. But at the same time as this, one could not then reduce Bukharin to Socrates, Lenin to Oedipus, and Trotsky to the sorcerer's apprentice, do away with questions properly belonging to the revolution by talking about the, quote, evil spell of living with other people, end quote, and end up in this desert of political skepticism where whatever might be said elsewhere, everything goes, where all projects sooner or later wither away, where every prospect for rational action ultimately is abolished. This metaphysics also was factitious in another sense. Khrushchev's, quote, revelations, end quote, confirm that the trials did not express political oppositions within the bureaucracy of the kind that can exist in bourgeois politics. The trials could not serve as an example, not even for a classical treatise on the conflicts between intention and result, between ends and means within an alienated world. The ruling circle's purging of a part of the bureaucracy certainly was not the result of Stalin's madness or of a cult of personality fallen from heaven, as Khrushchev would like to make us believe. The trials performed a social function. The terror cemented the bureaucracy together and sent a chill through the people for some period of time. They also performed a political function in that they sanctified the ruling group and the person incarnating the bureaucratic class without anyone's being able to challenge them. But at no time did the trials express a real political conflict lived as such by the protagonists. The execution of a few prominent ex-opponents among the thousands of Stalinists sacrificed was not aimed at liquidating political differences, which had been abandoned or wiped out many long years before. It was aimed rather at furnishing both a pretext and a political mask for this self-purging of the bureaucracy, at terrorizing true opponents who might eventually come forward by showing them the horrible fate of every opponent, even fictive opponents. Neither the, quote, mysteries of the Russian soul, end quote, nor more elegantly, if not more seriously, the complicity between the accused and the court, the fact that on the whole the accused adhered to the theory of objective guilt and freely lent themselves to the most effective staging, provided a quote, explanation, end quote, of these confessions. Bukharin, it was said, bowed before history and acknowledged his guilt because he was defeated. Bukharin, Khrushchev says, in fact, did not recognize anything at all. Torture had led him, quote, to a state of unconsciousness where he lost his judgment and abandoned his human dignity, end quote, so that one could make him say anything. Certainly, torture is not an absolute, and if people give in to torture, it is due to a particular psychology and a political perspective. Khrushchev's, quote, explanation, end quote, if it is superficially correct, is at the same time as a description of material facts incomplete and mechanistic, thereby expresses once again as a matter of fact the bureaucratic mentality of the interpreter. In Moscow, only those who already were ideological cadavers were tortured. As Victor Serge remarked at the time, not a single authentic revolutionary opponent of the regime figured in the trials. Torture could work only against people who had been broken politically a long time before, who had capitulated, who had recanted, who had in effect completely abandoned not only every revolutionary perspective, but every political attitude. Indeed, torture was effective only in a minority of cases. There were some suicides, and most of those shot were executed without public sentencing. Only those about whom one was sure were brought to the trials. Even among them, certain ones, like Ian Smirnov, during the trial of the 16, almost made everything fail. The, quote, complicity, end quote, of the accused was not before the court. We must search elsewhere for the condemned's, quote, solidarity, end quote, with the system that was going to shoot them. It was in their capitulation to and in their participation in a bureaucratic ideology and mentality. The moral resilience that allows a revolutionary to resist physical pressure and torture is of a piece, bracket, solidaire, end bracket, with everything he thinks, with everything he is. It is of a piece with his irreconcilable hatred of the system of exploitation and of the human type represented by the exploiters, their prosecutors and their police, and with the positive humanistic perspective he thinks gives him the right to oppose them. What appears as the revolutionary's heroism comes from the fact that certain ideas cling to his body more closely than his nails and his skin, and these ideas are nothing but the thoroughgoing criticism of exploitative society and the project of a human society. The strength of his heroism is the awareness of a radical scission with the oppressors, of the absolute opposition of two worlds. Now, the accused in the trial, whether we are talking about those in Moscow before the war or those in the satellite countries after the war, were in fact of a piece with the system of oppression that had just been set up. The successive groups of ex-Bolshevik capitulators whether previously they were, quote, left, end quote, or, quote, right, end quote, oppositionist or loyal to Stalin, never criticized the regime that had been established after 1923 unless they did it in superficial terms. Rather, they had contributed to its establishment. Still less were they capable of opposing to it a fundamentally different social outlook. Russia remained for them a socialist country, and socialism was the power of the bureaucracy, a power they would have liked to be less brutal. Where then could they have drawn the strength to oppose it? This is even clearer in the cases of the post-war purges in the satellite countries. In what way did the Reichs or Rajks, R-A-J-K, or the Kostovs and the Slanskys, whatever their individual peculiarities, differ politically? And we give to, quote, politics, end quote, here the Marxist meaning of a philosophy of history and a conception of man as these have entered into everyday practice. From the Rakosis and the Gottwalds. For the first group as well as for the second, it always was a matter of using working-class revolt to seize power by every means available to establish economic planning and a totalitarian dictatorship, whether at heart they call this, quote, socialism, end quote, and consider it as humanity's salvation matters little, both in general and for the purposes of our discussion. If the system turns against them, what motivation do they have to go on struggling? Nothing except personal salvation, and from that moment on, quote, confession, end quote, cuts short the torture and allows them to cling to the hope of mercy, the glimmering of which appear all the brighter now that the accused knows he has lost. In this sense, it is true that the, quote, confessions, end quote, imply that the accused recognized their ultimate identity with the judges. Not that they recognized in the latter victorious revolutionaries, but rather they recognized in themselves defeated bureaucrats. Ever since the first large Moscow trials, it has been clear that the accusations were entirely trumped up. For anyone who kept trying to think, the indictments were never anything but huge accumulations of monstrous falsehoods fabricated by clumsy prosecutors of mediocre intelligence who were allowed by totalitarian censorship and the bureaucracy's international promotional apparatus to botch their briefs, inventing at will non-existent hotels, airplane flights that never took place, etc. This does not mean that there was, outside Stalinist circles, a clamor against the imposture of the trials. On the contrary, faced with the new mystification already in the process of developing, we certainly should recall how the present rulers of Russia have as much blood on their hands as Stalin, that Khrushchev, Malenkov, Mikoyan, I don't know how to say that guy's name, Mikoyan, Mikoyan, Molotov, and Kaganovich wrote or had it written all day long during the trials, shoot the mad dogs, that Therese, Duclos, Tagliati, Pollitt, Gallagher, etc., participated actively in the murders by spreading lies, by keeping silent about all the contradictions, by treating anyone who dared to have doubts as a fascist or a cop. Even though they did not want to change from the role of brilliant and infallible bosses to that of cretins swallowing for a period of 20 years all the inventions of a, quote, madman, end quote, and a, quote, British spy, end quote, it remains true that, as far as they could, they themselves murdered their revolutionary opponents. Trotskyist, anarchist, Pumists, left socialist, everywhere they could, in Spain, in France, in Greece, in Indochina, at an ever vaster scale as they felt themselves coming closer to power. They continue these lies and these fabrications every day. For the past 4 months, the French Communist Party newspaper, Humanité, is but one long lie when it comes to the 20th Congress. The resolution of their Politburo is but one more lie when they pretend, quote, not to have known anything, end quote. they without whose active and conscious aid a good part of Stalin's crimes would not have been possible. This is kind of, sorry, this is just an aside, but this is reminding me of Homage to Catalonia. If you read that, he talks about how Orwell talks about how much the international Stalinist press, especially Great Britain's The Daily Worker, which I believe is still the a publication that comes out in a newspaper that comes out in Great Britain that was a Communist Party newspaper and is still written in by people like Lars Lee, who's like the supposed Lenin aficionado, and the fuck is that other guy's name? Ben something that wrote that like put together like the I don't fucking know what his name is. God, it's gonna kill me. I don't know, but he edited a thing of like Kautsky's writings in the historical materialism book series. Yeah, but he talks about how that George Orwell talks about how that newspaper was critical in destroying revolutionary possibilities in Spain by spreading lies internationally about the content of the POUM and the content of the CNT-FAI, the political content of those things, of those organizations. And they're still around today. And I doubt that they ever recanted any of the bullshit that they spread. But, can't be sectarian. Anyway, but even more should be recalled. We should recall that Stalin's crimes enjoyed the complicity of the whole of established society. For while revolutionary militants, even those who favored capitulation, even those who were dishonored in 1917, were being exterminated, bourgeois and reformists alike rejoiced. In fact, only after 1945, when the Cold War drove them to look for some arguments to back up their anti-Russian propaganda, and when all revolutionary movements seemed impossible to them, were they no longer afraid to reinforce working-class opposition to Stalinism. Only when the victims of the trials began to be taken from the rank and file of the Stalinist bureaucracy did they begin to, quote, denounce, end quote, the trials. Until then, almost every one of them were accomplices. The SFIO, whose Les Populaires kept quiet since 1934 about the GPU's crimes. First, the Stalin-Laval rapprochement, and later the Popular Front necessitated it. The Spanish socialists who gave a free hand to this very same Antonov Ovseyenko, whose unjust execution by Stalin Khrushchev today cries over, how unjust indeed, since Ovseyenko was, along with Marty, the organizer of the counter-revolutionary repression in Republican Spain, the Norwegian socialist in power in 1935 to 36, whose minister of, quote, justice, end quote, Trygve Trygve Lie, Lie, muzzled Trotsky for 3 months in 1936, right in the middle of the trial of the 16, isolating Trotsky and preventing him from defending himself against machinations aimed primarily at him. The French League of the Rights of Man, whose president, Victor Bosch, found the proceedings of the Moscow trials perfectly normal. The, quote, objective, end quote, journalist like Mr. Duranty, end quote, socialist, end quote, jurist like Mr. Pitt, counselor to His Majesty, who, having been invited to Moscow during the trials, found the proceedings impeccable and the verdicts justified, etc. All the intellectuals, quote, on the left, end quote, were accomplices too, with very rare exceptions, and we are not talking here about avowed Stalinists, but the whole vast group of close and distant, quote, sympathizers, end quote. the saints and the, quote, realists, end quote, the Romain Royans, Romain, Rollands, and the Jean Cassous, Cassous, who covered up this whole wretched operation with their moral authority, and all the others whom it would be tiresome to enumerate. They, quote, didn't know, end quote, either? What a pitiful excuse. Once one has read the official reports, just the slightest trace of intelligence is enough to realize that this could not have been true. Just the slightest trace of objectivity is enough to lend half an ear to the principal accused, Trotsky, and to find in his statements to the press, his articles, his books, the overwhelming and irrefutable proofs of this imposture. No, it was not out of ignorance, for some self-interest played a part, either directly or indirectly, as always. This is the case of least interest to us. For the others, it was a matter of, quote, sacrificing one's conscience, end quote, of, quote, effectiveness, end quote, of, quote, realism, end quote, of a resumption of the old conservative morality which, camouflaged under the tattered clothes of Marxism, allowed intellectuals, quote, on the left, end quote, to mystify themselves and endow their alienation with an ideological value. They devote themselves to the worship of the, quote, hard reality of history, end quote, which in fact is prostration before brute force, to the sublimation of the, quote, incarnation, end quote, which in fact is an opportunistic attitude toward established power, feeling all the more morally comfortable as this power presents itself as, quote, revolutionary, end quote. They have said, they are saying, and they will say again and again, that the truth would injure the USSR's cause, refusing to ask themselves up to what point a true cause can be defended by deceit, and confusing in stupid sophisms the deception of a revolutionary persecuted by the police and the deception of a police made up of persecutors pretending to be revolutionaries. The only results that count, they said, are those that reinforce socialism. But Khrushchev now says that the, quote, Khrushchev now says that the trials, quote, weakened, end quote, Russia, quote, considerably, end quote. Therefore, according to the results of their actions, all those who provided Stalin with ideological cover and moral security, who instead of laying down a barrage of public opinion against him, let him feel that he could do anything, and thus made it objectively possible for him to shoot 1, 10, then 100, then 1,000, all those people, quote, objectively, end quote, contributed to the weakening of Russia. They therefore should be shot according to their own standards. Wonderful paradoxes from this, quote, morality of results, end quote. These people pushed the accused into the grave because opposition to the regime, quote, objectively, end quote, transformed them into Gestapo agents. By doing this, however, they themselves were, quote, objectively, end quote, the agents of the British police and of the, quote, spy, end quote, Beria. And they can shift the blame away from themselves today only by placing it on their intentions. Are we naive? Is our indignation just a cause of bad manners? Is it not indecorous to mention the victims by name before their executioners, and impolite to insist upon the errors of others? Is it not normal for corpses to be found under the ground and murderers in power? For people to slip out of any difficulty by saying, quote, excuse me, but there was a mistake, end quote, and forecourt poets to sing Nero's praises after Caligula's? The cynicism of Stalinist rulers and intellectuals, if it is greater than that of others, is it at bottom any different? Do not Nazi functionaries stroll tranquilly around Bonn? Are they not day after day regaining their former positions of power? Is not Mollet president of the council? Is he not, Moyer president of the council? Is he not continuing the war in Algeria after having been elected on a promise to end it? Is this not what happens in society these days and more or less throughout the history of exploiting societies? Yes, of course, but it is not a question of indignation. Our purpose is to show once again with the example of the trials that the quote, communist, end quote, bureaucracy is an integral part of this society, that its methods and its attitudes are the age-old methods and behavior of oppressors, that it fights against an outmoded system of exploitation only to put in its place another, more modern and sometimes more horrible one, that its politics, like all others, expresses the same radical gulf between pretensions and reality, speeches and facts. Our purpose is to show that from this angle, which is the only important one, nothing fundamentally has changed with, quote, de-Stalinization, end quote. It is to struggle against the new mystification now being cooked up. For those named Stalinists who today go the farthest in acknowledging the, quote, mistakes, end quote, of the past, we may ask how many really make such acknowledgments, do so in appearance only to be able at bottom to continue to mystify others and to mystify themselves. What indeed do we see happening? We see that almost everybody, after having made some grudging pronouncements and looking around for some excuses, is in a hurry to conjure away both what happened and its meaning. They want to return quickly to the business at hand. Among some we see, quote, repentance, end quote, the public display of their tortured souls, which no one is asking for since no one is interested in it, instead of an analysis, an essay, an effort to see clearly into what happened and into their own actions. The proletarian revolution does not punish or wreak vengeance. It tries to construct the future consciously. The proletarian revolution has no need of repentance, but rather a lucid analysis of history. The disoriented intellectuals who, after having found a substitute for Catholicism in Stalinism, today see themselves suspended in the void, are less capable than ever of pursuing such an analysis. Their, quote, repentance, end quote, shows that they remain forever attached to the bourgeois bureaucratic universe at the very moment when they think they have detached themselves from it the most. Its political function is to provide a moral cover for the continued mystification of the Communist Party. The sacrifice of conscience, one's own and especially that of others, continues. It matters little if Claude Roy lives it henceforth as a heart-rending experience rather than as a sign of virility. It will be said, however, that everyone is demanding such a, quote, analysis, end quote. Indeed, Thérèse and Togliatti asked Khrushchev for an analysis. Why don't they begin it themselves? But Khrushchev is asking for an analysis too. From whom? Is it worth insisting upon? If the Communist Party, quote, demands an analysis, end quote, it is only a means for it to bury the question, to tranquilize the most troubled militants and to postpone discussion indefinitely. The manner in which it demands this analysis and the subject on which it would like such an analysis to focus, quote, to determine the entire set of circumstances in which Stalin was able to exercise personal power, end quote, show that this is all just camouflage. Everything holds together in a social system. As we have tried to show elsewhere in this issue, for a Marxist, Khrushchev's reports, the public as well as the secret one, means that the idea that the, quote, USSR is a socialist country, end quote, has exploded from within. Neither Khrushchev, i.e. the Russian bureaucracy, nor Thérèse, i.e. the bureaucracy of the French Communist Party, can provide an analysis of the, quote, entire set of circumstances, end quote, without disavowing from one end to the other both themselves and the system they represent. Let us set a date and wager that, with few exceptions, Stalinist intellectuals eventually will be content with, quote, analyses, end quote, differing little from those in which the, quote, spy Beria, end quote, plays the leading role.